Hello, everyone. We are privileged to speak with Dr. Richard Firth Godbehere. He is the author of Delicious History, A History of Emotions, recently translated into Romania by the Trei Free Publishing House. Thank you very much for the joy, the big joy of this dialogue, Mr. Richard Firth Godbehere.
No problem at all. Thank you for speaking to me.
My first question is this one. Have our emotions and feelings built the best of all possible worlds?
Oh, there's a big question. Probably not, because there are emotions and feelings that can do very bad things, like start wars and oppress people and things like that. The emotions are, their job really is to keep us alive. That's their basic job, to stop us from dying in situations where, say, you see a rustling in a bush. Those of you that go and investigate get eaten by the bear. Those of you that feel fear and run away, you have children and pass on your children. That's basic. And that doesn't often tie in with morals and doing the right thing. Some do. Disgust, for example, is very tied to morality. You feel revulsion at things, people acting badly as you would food that's bad. But yeah, whether emotions built the best possible world, I don't know. They built a world, but that's all I could say.
Okay, how do we measure as correctly as possible the way in which emotions participate in the history of the world? How can we measure such a thing like emotions?
Measuring is difficult, actually measuring them. Do you mean as in how strong they are, how weak they are? How do we just find out what emotions are responsible for what in history? If you mean how do we find out? Well, there's a whole field, the history of emotions. And me and my colleagues at the Centre for the History of Emotions, one of three, there's one in Berlin and one also in Australia. We go the same way as other historians. We go to archives, we look at text, we find people talking about their emotions, either directly or indirectly. We try and work out what on earth they're talking about, because often it can be quite strange and alien, especially if it's a dead language like Latin or Greek or ancient Hebrew. And we, from that, extract what they're talking about, why they are talking about those emotions, why they're important in that point in history, and work out how they had an impact on history that way. How, if you like, and we measure how powerful they were. And we use all sorts of different history techniques. We might look at how philosophers try to work out what emotions are, or we might look at how people in their day-to-day lives talked about emotions just in ordinary writing, or how people express their emotions on, say, gravestones, and how that changed over time from being, for example, there is in London at my university, we still have a Jewish graveyard. It's very old, and the oldest gravestones have Hebrew text from the Bible. And then the newer ones are very kind of Christian, the father and loving husband, and you can see how the way people dealt with bereavement changed over time emotionally, just from gravestones, for example. So that's the kind of way we get in there and try and measure how people felt in the past and how they understood their emotions, all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm. What is this new discipline, the history of emotions?
It's exactly what it says on the box. It's the history of emotions. It's looking at emotions in history. So it's looking at what people think emotions were. So what they are for and what they are, that changes at what people believe they are, changes over time. So, for example, in most of Europe until about 1800, we didn't have this thing, emotions. We had other things, passions, which were one set of feelings, and we had sentiment, which were another set of feelings, and we had affects, which were yet another set of feelings. So passions were things you felt in the body, then your brain acknowledged and went, oh, I don't feel very good. Whereas affects were things when you thought about something, you realize that should make me mad. Then you react to it. And they all had their different categories. Now we have this new one, emotions. And that's kind of an English-speaking world one. Even in Spain, for example, they have slightly different categories. In German, they have more than one category of feeling. So it's a cultural thing as well as a historical thing. But also, when it's an emotion we recognize, we historians, we look at things and say, is that what we think it is? We see sadness, but do people think about sadness in the same way in the past as they do now? Do they think about love in the same way in the past as they do now? So yeah, love is a great example. Love now is the beating heart you feel for your wife or your partner, and whereas in the past it was more an attraction to something, and the ultimate attraction in Christendom anyway was being attracted to the center, to God. It's more being pulled to something. So emotions change over time, and also more importantly, things don't happen in history because people logic themselves into it. You don't sit with a logic table and say, let's work out why I'm going to go to war or why I'm going to murder this person, do all your equations. You get angry, or you get annoyed, or you get frustrated. So emotions drive history, and they were neglected for so long, and we're here to put that right.
Mm-hmm. The more specific question is this one: how do you build your history of emotion, a history, not the history, and how do you choose to tell this history? Tell us about the main parts of the architectures of your.
Well, with my book, the book I'm releasing, this book is an attempt for me to tell the world that there is a history of emotions. And so basically, I've done a wide sweep of the history of emotions from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Hebrews right through to the future. In fact, we go slightly into the future by the end, and anything I could find in between. And what I was looking to do was give a representative of the different ways that I and others do the history of emotions. So some of it about half the book was things I've worked on and I know. So if it's about discuss, I research discuss by looking at text very closely, and it's a combination of me using computers, corpus linguistics, that can scan text and find words and find associated words, and then I can go in and analyze that very closely, and just good old-fashioned close reading of documents in the archive and making notes and blowing dust off old bits of paper to find something new in there. That's how I build it up. That's how I work my part. The other half, to be honest, was leaning on my colleagues very heavily and saying, you're an expert on love. Can I have a chat? And having a conversation, working out, and then doing a bit of research for myself, because being a historian, there's an old story. If you put two historians together in a room, you'll have three opinions at the end of it. So I would then go and check and read other stuff. But it was a combination of archival work and that kind of, also a bit of science research, because I also have I work in psychology and linguistics, so I would look at the latest papers on the science of each emotions and see how that interacts with the history and what I'm reading about desire or love or whatever. So that's kind of how I built it, either my own research or starting with usually a drink down the pub with a colleague and saying, well, last couple of years it was more a drink over Zoom with a colleague, and saying, right, where should I start this research, and going from there.
Mm-hmm. What are the emotions privileged by this kind of history? And let me be a little bit provocative. What emotions also important do you think are wronged by a history of emotions?
Do you mean, what did I leave out? I would love to have included a lot more. I would love to have included a lot more on fear, because I talk about it a bit, but it's a very, very important historical emotion. It's one of the most basic primeval emotions we have. But it's also very difficult to get your hands around when I'm only doing a short chapter on a particular emotion. There are other things like surprise. I'm fascinated by the idea of surprise. Why are we shocked by things? Why are we amazed by things? And the whole idea of being surprised, and just the reason we have science is because we like to be, what's the word for it, amazed and amazement. So that kind of thing I'd love to have looked at more. And the ones I chose are the ones I either know about because I've researched, desire and disgust and and so on, or ones that I know are interesting, are important to the history of emotions. So, for example, I talk about love at the time of the Crusades, and the reason I talk about that is because one of the first important papers in the history of emotions was a paper called Crusading as an Act of Love, which is sounds very strange, but the argument is the reasons why they thought they were doing it, not that it was a loving thing to do. Obviously, it wasn't, but it was about why the Crusaders felt they had the right to do it, and it was kind of this weird sort of love. So that paper's in there because it's important. It's important to the history of my field. So many emotions I would have loved to have included, but I had a word count limit. My publisher said 90 to 100,000 words, no more. I could have done a 3-series step like Lord of the Rings, I suppose, and just gone on loads and loads of other emotions. But yeah, but I like surprise. That fascinates me, and fear. I'd like to have gone into quite a lot more. It is important.
On the other hand, what emotions usually provoked great changes in history? What are the greatest emotions driving forces of history?
Probably there are two main big ones. One is, and I think instantly now, one is love. One is the idea of belongingness, is a better way of word than love, and that's the feeling that keeps groups together, keeps families together, keeps nations together. But it's also the feeling that puts other nations and other people apart, pushes them away. They're not us. You know, we are us. We belong together. They're not us. They should be out there. And so almost every conflict and every problem and every resolution to those problems has been this belongingness, this love has been involved in that at some level. You know, we now need to stop fighting and become a bigger group now. Let's stop that. Let's create a European Union, for example, which is a sore point being a Brit, but we'll move on. But and with that kind of thing. The other one is my favorite, which is disgust, which is revulsion, because that's the moral gatekeeper. And a lot of the reasons we react badly and have bad reactions to people who commit crimes, for example, is because it, for some reason, our brain generates the same feeling when somebody acts out of character with our culture, or does something we think they shouldn't, as it does when we see a rotten apple. Our brain kind of knows the difference, but we feel the same way.
You work with the concept, strong concept, the emotional regime.
Yes.
Is an emotional regime, and why is so important for your architecture of understanding a history of emotions?
An emotional regime is basically it is that the way of understanding and expressing emotion that our culture or even our circumstance dictates. It's the way it's we're pressed to emote in certain ways. And the classic example always given is an air steward. You're an air steward on a very, very posh first-class airline. In fact, not even first class, it's a private jet company. You're the very, very best of air stewards on this private jet. And you have a customer who is rude. They are rude to you, and they swear at you, and they treat you like rubbish. But your emotional regime means you've got to continue to be polite to them. And if they ask for a pillow, you say, "Certainly, sir, I will fetch you a pillow," and you smile, because there's this imposed regime. And that happens at a greater level. It happens within culture. This is how you're supposed to behave when you feel things. This is manners. This is behaving correctly. This is how you should comport to yourself. And that changes over time. So one of the things you can do in the history of emotions is look at how those regimes change from place to place, and from country to country, and from time to time. And that you can track changes in attitudes to all sorts of things by how those regimes change. And that's the main way I used it, or we use it. And it is important, because emotional regimes are one of the driving forces of culture. You can tell that culture is different to that culture, often by what is taboo and what isn't in different cultures, what is allowed and what isn't. Now, as a Brit, I'm happy to use my phone on a train when I'm going somewhere. But to do that in Japan, that would be the height of bad manners, because their emotional regime is different. And so that's a little thing, but there are big things as well that can change things. But yeah, that's the emotional regime and why it's important.
You also wrote about a new perspective about the emotions. How can we change the perspective from which we usually view and reflect on emotions, on their impacts, on their effects in the history?
You mean changing perspective, looking at things differently, trying to think differently about emotions? I think the best way is to understand that emotions aren't there. For a long time, since the 1970s, it was believed that there are a basic set of universal emotions that are set in stone. All humans have them, and they're always the same. No matter where you go, you can be in the jungles of Papua New Guinea or New York City, they'll have the same basic emotions. We now know that's not necessarily the case. It's more complicated. Emotions are a much more complicated thing. And the more you understand that emotions are complicated and different, and even individuals experience emotions differently to other people. I experience my emotions differently to you, and you experience your emotions differently to everybody else, even if it's very slight. The more you understand that, the more you can understand people. The more you can understand, you can have a different perspective on the way people behave and the way feelings are, and think, why are they doing that? Is it just how they were raised? Is it just what they think is right? Is there some other reason for those emotions? Whereas if you think emotions are all set in stone, you just think they're wrong and they need dealing with and they need punishing because they're doing it wrong. So that can change. And also looking at history, knowing that when you examine history, you can take a different perspective on history and say, okay, why are they behaving like that? Why did the French Revolution happen? Is it just because they, again, sat with equations and worked out, let's get rid of our royal family? No, it's because their emotions have been so repressed and held down for so long. Sooner or later, they were going to burst out. They were going to explode, and that anger was going to overwhelm the country, which is what eventually happened. And you can understand that if you can get in there and see their perspective.
Are the religions and the philosophies the broadest, the most complex emotional, let's say, installation, emotional devices?
Possibly, yes. I mean, they're always arguing about them. Even Plato and Aristotle argued about how emotions work to a degree. They had they both thought there were they're part of the soul that did the emotion thing, and they both thought there were certain opposites, love and hate, and pleasant and unpleasant, and so on. But yeah, they argued about them, and when philosophers argue about things, they usually get complicated. This is how philosophy works. Someone else will come in with a third version, and there'll be a fourth version, a fifth version, a sixth version, and it gets very complicated, it gets very broad and sweeping. And religions too. Religions like to argue, apparently. And so you'll have religious people. One religion will say this is how emotions work, this is how we should feel, and another group will say, oh, no. I don't agree with that. This is what we should be feeling. Then the next group will say, well, hang on, that's not right either. So Buddhism is all about, at its core is about desire, and most importantly, desiring to not desire, desiring to shed your desire. And so having no desire for anything and letting everything go. So they have a whole emotional landscape based around this idea of desire and clinging on to things and letting go of that clinging. On the other hand, Christianity, there is a strong sense of desire, the desire for heaven, the desire for reward, the desire for an afterlife. So they are driven by desire and let it overcome them because it's important. So, yeah.
But literature, how do you could analyze it in relation to the history of emotions? What kind of form for emotion is literature, let's say?
Literature. It depends on the literature. I talk about emotional regimes in the wider world. There are emotional regimes within genres. So, if I was a historian looking at literature, some genres in literature are all about emotion. Your cheap love books, love novels, They're all flocking about emotions and love and people falling in love and so on. As a historian, I might go to an archive and I will find court records. Now, court records are interesting because as a literature form of literature, they're not supposed to have any emotions in them, but they do. That's what drives the court. In great works of literature are very good at trying to pull on as many emotional heartstrings as it can. They like, you can analyze Shakespeare, for example. If you look at Shakespeare, you will find in there, he will take you from feeling revulsion to making you laugh like that. Well, making you laugh if you were around in the 17th century is not so funny these days, but back in the day, he was hilarious. So he will, for example, he will have a character pick up a skull and go feet, which is basically yuck or whatever, at this, and then he'll say something funny about it. And that's because great literature likes to pull emotions, and the more it pulls, the better it is at manipulating your emotion, the better the literature tends to be. So that's kind of how that's the literature part of it. I have a very good friend, Bradley Irish, who's actually releasing a book on disgusting Shakespeare very soon. So keep an eye out for that, because you can really get how the literature thing works through his work. That's what he does, really analyzes closely literature.
Is the history of emotions more vulnerable than other kind of histories? It is easier to criticize, to contest. We can say, for example, here in the history of emotions, there is too much emotion. Is there too much personality, subjective?
I don't think it's pretty much all history has a subjective element. There's always there are the two type elements of history. There are the facts. There are that in, for example, let me think of an example. In the late 60s, man went to the moon. Humans went to the moon. We landed on the moon. We know that. That's a fact. That's a historical fact. Most people, not everybody, most people don't debate that. On the other hand, why America went to the moon is a much more subjective, much more difficult question to answer. They'll tell you why, and you might not believe them. They'll say, oh, we wanted to advance science. And yeah, but Russia, you know, what about them? And they go, oh, yeah, it had nothing to do with emotions. We just wanted to advance science. So you didn't do it because you were frightened of Russia and their big missiles. That's no fear involved. And so it gets very muddy. And a lot of history by its nature has to be kind of postmodern. You have to understand that there is more than one answer. So it's not necessarily a case of critiquing it, unless your facts are wrong. It's a case of saying, okay, that's one part of the puzzle. The fear of the rise of the Soviets, them getting to space first, and them demonstrating their technology, which is basically saying, look how big our rockets are. What if we put a nuclear bomb on top of one of those? That's what Russia were doing. So America responded by saying, yeah, we can get to the moon. So we've got bigger rockets and they're better. That's one element. And someone else will come along and say, yeah, but there's this other element to it. They won't necessarily say you're wrong about the fear, although they sometimes do. They'll say, oh, I think you're overblown about the fear. Actually, it's more a sense of pride and in the nation that drove it. They wanted to be proud, and you'll have this. So it is vulnerable. No more, I'd say, vulnerable than any other kind of history is vulnerable. And we kind of work within that vulnerability. We realise that can happen. That's just where history is.
Two last questions. Let's say from a philosophical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Did emotions build the world and its history much more than logic, than reason? Can we speak about reason of emotions? Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, said the heart has its reasons which reason does not understand.
Yeah, it's a bit like David Hume, who said that reason is and ought to be a slave to the passions, same sort of thing. This is where modern science comes in, okay? Antonio Damasio, fabulous scientist. He's written a book called Descartes' Error, and he's written others, and his research and other research based on his is showing that outside of facts, outside of this is a glass of water, which is a fact. It might be vodka. It's not. It's water. But outside of that, you cannot make a decision without using both reason and emotions at the same time. They are deeply intertwined. So even the most basic things, I'll talk to a scientist who will tell me that they are entirely based on logic and reason. Everything they do is based on logic and reason. It's nothing to do with emotions. And then I'll say to them, so why did you choose quantum physics? And they'll say, because I love it. It's fascinating. And I go, aha, because you love it. You know, there's a passion in there. There's an emotional thing. If there wasn't, you wouldn't study it. It'd be boring just sitting doing all that maths all the time. But you love the maths. You have a passion for it. You see beauty in it. So there is an emotional element. And that's kind of true of everything. So say which is more important. I think they live together. It's hard to separate them most of the time. Unless, like say, you say, what is that? It's a glass of water. You don't need emotions for that. 1 on 1 equals 2. That's just the way it is. You don't need emotions for that. But everything else, which is what Thomas Hobbes told us 500 years ago, we're finally catching up.
It was wonderful. Dr. Richard Firth, Godbehere, congratulations for your amazing book. And
Thank
it
you.
has been a great honor and a great pleasure for me to have this dialogue. I thank you very, very much for this.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. It's been fun. Thank you.